Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you very much to the Planning Committee for the honor of being the keynote at this talk. This is not the first time that I've engaged Hopkins School of Public Health on the animals and public health issue. In fact, I had a meeting with Al Summer, I'm not sure, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, saying that there were huge opportunities for Hopkins to develop an animals and public health course. Al had his mind on bigger things, such as Michael Bloomberg's $100 million, and he didn't really pay much attention to the animals and public health issue. But I'm glad that it's been revived and that we are now sort of looking at it as a serious issue, and delighted that it's part of the ethics program, because values and animals are an integral part. You can't separate the two of them. So I've got a variety of issues. My job is to sort of set the scene for this, and so I'm going to try and ensure that all of these topics are relevant to both public health and also ethics. And so I have very little in here about ethics, but I will dabble on the ethical issues from time to time. So when you look at public support for animal protection, there was a huge amount of discussion about animal protection back in the late 1800s. And Hopkins was an integral part of that. By the way, I neglected to mention that public health and animals is something that Hopkins was steeped in early on. So William Osler has been credited with developing the One Health concept. Others have said that that's not true, but he did teach at both veterinary schools and medical schools, had a very active campaign to make sure that health professionals were taught by looking at cases. And so William Osler, there was a lot of attention to animals and public health or animal issues back in the late 1800s. And Welch, one of the other 4 founding fathers of Hopkins, was an active advocate against a bill that was introduced into DC to regulate animal research in DC in 1894, which was supported, by the way, by 6 Supreme Court justices and all the major religions at the time, as opposed by Welch, by the AMA, by the newly established American Physiological Society, and eventually it went down to defeat. Well, it never went anywhere, because 1894 was the year in which the first therapy that could be identified as coming from animal research was introduced, and that was the diphtheria antitoxin. All the rest of the developments up until that time could be argued, well, you don't need to do animal research, just good clinical care, etc. So that's 1894 was a singular year for the whole animal research issue. At any rate, here is an engram. I don't know how many of you play with Google Ngram Viewer, but it's a fascinating little device. And so a fascinating app. And so you can type in words, animal welfare, animal rights. And animal rights, you can see, is mentioned in more of the books in the late 80s and 1990s than animal welfare, but both of these are sort of increasing dramatically. And you follow the money if you want to really see what's happening in public discourse. And this is the inflation-adjusted money going into animal protection in the United States. So it's gone up since 1960 by about 4.5-fold. And it's continuing to climb. Not really sure where that peak is. I think it could double over what it is now, and maybe even triple. So there's interesting developments in the animal protection sphere in terms of public attitudes. There's also, Gallup has been doing this poll on moral acceptability of various sort of public health or human health issues. And so you can see that the animal research, support for animal research was high. It's slowly dropping. Support for the wearing of fur is also going down. You can't really discern much from the actual year-to-year data. You have to do trend lines to see what's actually happening. But it's interesting, you know, I mean, even something like doctor-assisted suicide is, the support for that is going up, although it started off very low. Or this is cloning of humans, sorry. So it started off very low, but people are beginning to accept it. But the animal use elements here are basically public support for them is declining. And in fact, if you look at the animal research, there's another set of data from 85 to 2001 where this graph starts that shows a decline in public support for animal research by about 20 percentage points, a huge drop in social studies terms. So we're sitting here with a lot of interest in the animal issues, animal protection, animals in society. So let's look at the sort of four main themes that you have here. We don't have companion animals in any of the sort of sessions to follow, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that than might otherwise be. So animal-assisted therapy, animal-assisted activities really is a relatively recent issue, but it still is largely ignored by the medical profession and largely feared in some respects. The medical research community really doesn't pay much attention to this issue, and as a result, the scientific data supporting the idea that animal-assisted therapy is a good thing is weak. And so in the 1960s, the earliest signs of something that was happening was Boris Levinson, a psychiatrist, had a dog, Jingles, that he'd bring with him to his sessions. And Jingles he was a child psychiatrist, and Jingles turned out to be as effective as Boris at easing the fears and anxieties of his patients. And he became very focused on what Jingles could do and started writing about animal-assisted therapy. Got a huge amount of public attention as a result. Not much medical attention. His psychiatric colleagues thought he was a bit of a fool before doing this. And then in the 80s, the whole idea of the human-animal bond came on, and animal-assisted therapy interest grew. Pet food companies sponsored some research, tended to be master's theses, small sample sizes, relatively short-term, and as a result, not terribly persuasive in the literature. There have been one or two major studies. One of them was Erica Friedman, who's somewhere, I think she's over at Baltimore, the University of Maryland, Baltimore. So she's around here. But Erica looked at heart attacks and looked at the impact of having a pet on whether or not you were likely to suffer a relapse. And people who had pets were much less likely. So this was an early paper that caused a lot of excitement, but it was not really followed up in a very systematic way, and there's very little money to support research into this field. In 1987, NIH organized a technology assessment workshop. This is one of those devices to explore new technologies. And one of the things that happens in technology assessment workshops is that you ask for the various institutes to support it with funding. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute were invited. The National Institute of Mental Health was invited, both of whom had significant sort of scientific developments in the field supporting the idea that animals conferred some positive therapeutic benefit, neither of whom ended up funding the workshop. And the workshop's conclusions were not terribly, this is not an area where there's a lot of strong research, and we need more money. Well, there was no more money. The pet food companies had stopped funding research at that time, and there were a couple of foundations that had funded some research, but those dried up. And so very little more happened until 2007, and Mars, the big candy pet food company, teamed up with NICHD and started funding more significant projects. And so we're talking about $500,000 research projects, and we're beginning to see the outcomes of some of that work. So there are a few key papers. From 1960s to 2007, mostly confined to veterinary journals. There was one significant paper in JAMA that showed a significant impact of service dogs on severely disabled humans. Their psychological health improved, their demand on medical services declined, but interestingly, the field itself attacked the paper for being unethical and fraudulent. So JAMA never published another paper because they got lots of criticism from within the service dog field that the paper was a fraud. So there are a number of reasons why we don't see a lot of medical research attention to this issue. But I think that it's going to start happening, and this is animal-assisted therapy, the n-gram viewer of the increase in interest in these issues. If one looks at Google, this is another version of what one might look at in terms of Google-assisted or Google searches for animal-assisted therapy. You can see there's been a huge increase since 2010. There's a lot of excitement about the use of therapy dogs for PTSD treatment, especially of veterans. And who could not look at that picture and say, boy, there's something here. But that's what we're looking at. We're looking at these anecdotes, and there's very little continuing and long-term studies on these. So you've got hippotherapy, produces remarkable results in some cases. I can tell you 2 or 3 anecdotes where individuals really were changed by hippotherapy. But there are no case studies. This is something I started the journal in this field, Anthrozoos, in 1987, edited it for the first 10 years, and I constantly was out there banging on people's doors saying, send me case studies, send me disciplined case studies. Nobody ever did. And so there are no case studies showing this change that happens in some of these individuals. We've got some recent research on pets, children, and asthma that being raised with pets is good for you. It reduces your incidence of asthma. So, and this is fairly strong stuff, and as a result, you know, one could say that you should have pets with children. In actual fact, if you look at pet ownership in American families, the highest rate of pet ownership is in families with children. It's about 75, 78% of families with children have pets, whereas single family couples and single households, it's about 40% have pets. So it's about double when you have children. And then there's a lot of touting of the value of pets for the elderly. The research here is very mixed, and I think that what's happening is that as you get older, you have enough trouble getting yourself to the doctor, let alone getting your pet to the veterinarian. So the costs of keeping a pet as you get older rise, and the benefits stay the same. So what you have is that the benefits are level, the costs slowly rise, and so the rate of pet ownership declines. So the 75-year-old plus life stage group, only about 20-25% of them have pets at home. So pet ownership declines dramatically. We have very little actual information on pet ownership. It's one of the huge deficits in this field. And yet, if you can see dogs per 100, we vary from 1.4 in Turkey to 19.6 in Mexico. There are 40 dogs per 100 people on the island of Saipan. There are 0.1 dog per 100 people in Bangladesh. There's about a 400, 500-fold difference in the number of dogs per 100 people across the globe. This is something I can tell you is still not widely recognized, and yet it's not driven by dog breeding behavior. Dog breeding behavior, dog reproductive capacity may vary by a factor of about 2. Large dogs have litter sizes twice the size of small dogs. So this isn't a result of dog breeding behavior. This is entirely a result, I argue, of human behavior. And yet we pay the rabies, the folk who treat rabies or trying to eliminate rabies across the globe are paying very little attention to human behavior, much more attention to getting all the dogs vaccinated. And cats, you see similar ranges in cats per household. Once again, not very much research on this. It's limited to a few small interest groups around the globe as to how many cats there are, but there's a lot of uproar at the moment about cats eating birds, and the conservation biology community has produced a lot of rhetorical material, and I argue advisedly it's rhetorical because they haven't paid much attention to some of these data, that cats are a major threat to birds and other animals in the environment. I'm very interested in the issue of dog bites. We can talk about rabies certainly, but dog bites is a much more common occurrence than rabies. And here are some data from, this is, the blue line is Jaipur in India, the red line is Ahmedabad, and this is month by month. And as you can see, there's a huge increase in dog bites in Ahmedabad in what are the dog breeding months. So this is where the males are chasing the females, and this is where the puppies are produced. And so you get this big increase in terms of bite rate because there are puppies and dogs mating. Jaipur, the reason why the graph is so much shallower is because they've been investing in a dog sterilization program since 1994, and 75% of the females are sterilized, so you don't get that breeding behavior bump. But in actual fact, the decline is here. This is the decline in dog bites treated in hospitals in Jaipur. It's come down about 75% over 17 years. A huge decline, shows that we don't have to live with this rate of dog bites. We can do something about it. This isn't just a minor issue. It's a huge health cost issue. People are treated. These are people who've gone to the clinics in Jaipur to get treatment. In India, it's mostly post-exposure rabies treatment, and also there will be some treatment, some surgical correction as well. Here's a range of dog bite rate from one community to another. Calgary, I think it's less than 1 rather than less than 5. It's the poster child for that we don't have to live with dog bites. We can avoid it. But you can see in the USA, the actual dog bite rate is 104 per 100,000 people. Those are the dog bites treated in emergency rooms. And in rural, it's 29. In rural, it's 119. In urban, it's 29. The reason for this is because there are 4 times more dogs per human in the rural areas as in the urban areas. Greece, it's 200. Netherlands, it's 60. Jaipur, it was 721, it's now down to 181, and Berhampur, another community in India, it's 1,250. So there's a lot. What we find is that sterilization has a big impact on these numbers, and we just now have to do the economics of this to demonstrate it's not just a minor issue, it's something where sterilization can in fact save a lot of money over the long term. Disease and zoonoses from dogs, of course. This is rabies in Chennai, and they started a sterilization program in 1994. Up until that time, the city of Madras had been catching and killing dogs. Every year, caught and killed more dogs, and every year the rabies incidence stayed the same. They started doing the sterilization program, and it's down to 0 now, 2009. It's gone up a little because they've expanded the corporation boundaries into rural areas, and there's a couple of cases coming in from rural areas. In terms of dailies, what you see here is leishmaniasis and rabies are amongst the most significant diseases in terms of dailies, the disability life years lost, in terms of the cost. And so lots of public health issues associated with dogs. Okay, so that's companion animals. I hope you feel that there's a huge opportunity here for more attention and more in-depth analysis, both economic and health-wise, in terms of dealing with our human companion animal bond. Farm animals. The diseases of domestication basically came in when humans settled and started farming around sort of 10,000 BC. They started living in more concentrated communities, and you started seeing diseases spreading in those communities. When it was just small bands, sort of hunter-gatherer bands roaming around the countryside, they didn't have enough of a population really to sort of support some of these diseases. And 58% of human diseases are zoonotic. So when you start living with animals, you get this type of issue and problem. In terms of the emerging infectious diseases, or emerging diseases, there were two main periods for emerging infectious diseases, that 9 to 10,000 BC period and currently. And then we had a change in disease incidence in 1900, mostly now being argued due to better nutrition. And you got lots of people saying that we've conquered the infectious diseases in the 60s, we don't need to worry about them anymore, and worry only about chronic diseases like heart attacks and strokes and cancer. So, but we can see now that the infectious diseases were just sleeping for a while and are back in full force to worry us. And the avian flu issue is a huge worry. So you've got, just one example. I have to say that I find it extraordinary that public health, any public health organization, is willing to accept the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics in feed. But the AVMA still does. And you've got scientists out there sort of saying, just the same way that Senator Cruz said yesterday, that global climate change is just simply an issue so the Washington elite can get more money into their programs. There's been this constant drumbeat, but we haven't proved that this resistant bacteria was caused by subtherapeutic antibiotics, and it's now causing this disease in a single human. Because we haven't proved that, it's been something that we've been unable to regulate. The Europeans now are beginning to regulate it, but the US is still subsisting on voluntary guidelines. And the good news there is that some of the companies are beginning to withdraw, but this is a huge market. 80% of antibiotics are fed to animals. Huge issue. And this is why they're fed to animals. The use of antibiotics has cut down disease in these crowded conditions. Vitamin D discovery in the 1920s led to the development of these conditions, as well as the emigration of labor from the rural areas into the cities. So when farmers no longer had labor to deal with their animals, they had to find ways of caring or raising the animals with much less labor. So this, according to David Fraser, I don't know if he's in the room yet, but according to David Fraser, was one of the reasons why we ended up with these sorts of systems. 50% of the hens laying eggs in the globe today are in these conditions. And this is foie gras production. If you see this, the idea that foie gras is a desirable food type is just extraordinary. I mean, and that's what's happening now in the food industry in the United States. In the last 5 years, there's been a huge shift away from confinement agriculture. And we're going to have to sort of deal with this sort of mechanization and sort of industrialization of animal agriculture in a more effective way, because the public, when they see this, won't accept it. And that's why these ag-gag laws have been promoted by industry to try and avoid the public ever seeing this. In terms of ethics and values and intensive confinement systems, these systems are bad for water quality, they're bad for environmental quality, they're bad for food quality, perhaps. They're bad for community social health, they're bad for community physical health, MRSA, one example. They're very bad for animal welfare for the most part, and they're positive for food cost. So we can produce cheap food using these systems. But it's cheap only in the sense of the direct costs of that production. If you look at all of the indirect costs, the costs that aren't counted for, it's not cheap at all. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing, I think, this huge shift away from this. And what we're looking at now is we've got a campaign against the World Bank trying to get them to stop funding intensive confinement systems. That's the next step that we need to take it from McDonald's and Walmart and the other major companies beginning to shift away from battery cages and gestation crates. We need to get the funders to stop funding these things. So the lab animal issue. Again, there's going to be quite a lot of talk about this over the course of the next day and a half. So I just want to provide some very basic context. When you look at laboratory animal use, and this is indexed to 1 for the high point, and it's the US, Netherlands, and the UK, you can see that all 3 countries followed much the same thing. And some of these points I've had to they're guesstimates rather than accurate estimates of numbers. But by and large, I've got enough points in this chart that I'm fairly confident that this is accurate. And you can look at it in terms of what's actually happened in labs over the years. And you see this huge increase in animal use up to about 1975, and then a huge decline, and now another sort of blip back upwards as the GMO mice revolution takes over. If you look at the UK numbers, this is the breeding of GMO mice, and these are the various other, this is the basic research, this blue line here, you can see it's gone up, but this is pharmaceutical research or protection applied studies, and here are a couple of small things for quality control and so on. If you look at commercial use of animals in the UK, this is what's happened. So there's this huge decline from about 1975 to about 2005, and then it's pretty much leveled off. And the use of animals, the breeding of mice, has gone up hugely. But the use of those mice is still relatively sparse, about 10% of mice. Yes?
Is this all animals, fish, insects?
It's all animals in the UK statistics. And the UK does count fish. The zebrafish revolution is another part of the numbers, and typically you don't see those as much. In terms of what's been happening, I've been in this field since '76. I started work for Frame in London in '76. And so I've been engaged in advocacy on the animal research issue for 40 years. And what I've observed is that until about 5 years ago, that the sort of mantra that we have to do animal research, there's nothing else we can do, was the dominant mantra. And it was tough to argue against that. But the past 5 years, I've seen a big change. And the arguments now are much more in favor of a different approach. And so that sort of leveling off of animal use that you saw on the last slide, I think that these charts, you're going to see this number start to come down again as we move into a new phase. And tox testing is a classic example of this. Because we're now testing about 150 chemicals thoroughly a year globally. The EU has 30,000 chemicals, or 25 to 30,000 chemicals in its REACH program, and their aim is to test 50 of them a year. And that's fundamentally ridiculous. If you think that we need to have better information on these chemicals, and you can only test 50 a year, how odd is that? In carcinogenicity, we've got about 600 chemicals that have been tested thoroughly for using the standard mouse-rat test model, NCI test model. And of those 600 chemicals, only 20% are subject to regulatory decision by the EPA, because the data on the other 80% are not particularly convincing. So even when we do the full-term testing, the results are problematic. When you look at the relevance of animal test data and the relevance of in vitro test data, There was a study in 2000 by Osler et al. That looked at the relevance of animal data to human outcomes. And it showed that the animal data predicted human outcomes about 50 to 60% of the time. Better in some systems than others, but overall it was about 50 to 60%. But that was only when you included half a dozen or even more animal species. If you were just looking at rat and one non-rodent, it was 50%. To me, it's 50 to 60%. There was an analysis of in vitro data, the EPA's ToxCast program, done by the Hamner Institute a few years ago. And they concluded that the ToxCast program was predictive about 50 to 60% of the time. So almost exactly the same. And yet, if you look at the literature, you will see people pointing to the Osler et al. Study saying animal testing is a good thing, it's sufficient, it provides us with valuable data, and the in vitro data is not yet up to mark. And yet, the relevance is exactly the same. But there's this huge emotional tie to the fact that if the rat dies, it must be bad for us, and if the rat lives, it's okay, versus if the cell culture dies, well, who the hell can tell what's going on? So there's been this big shift the last 5 years. One is challenging the scientific validity of many of the animal tests because they're not double-blinded, they don't follow this sort of Cochrane model of top-class research. And then the other is the relevance issue. And then you add the cost and speed issue. We can test 10,000 chemicals a year in 200 different endpoints, cell culture systems, at 15 different chemical concentrations for about 100 million. If we did that in animals, it would cost billions and billions of dollars and would take us 10, 15, 20 years if the capacity was there. And as I've indicated, the capacity isn't there. So why is it that REACH is not using in vitro data out the wazoo? Why is it that we are still struggling with this animal test data issue that's not terribly relevant, very expensive, very slow, and not doing the job? So these are the things that, from my perspective, there's been a huge change, and we are going to see this change. Yes, I admit that we don't really understand what a cell culture, the data from the cell culture system means for human outcomes, but that's merely a problem now. In 5, 10 years' times with improved bioinformatics and this flood of data coming from these high throughput systems, animal data produces a trickle, a drop, a drop, a drop. The high throughput systems produce a fire hose quantity of data, and one of the things about modern computers is that they need lots of data. And then we can start doing interesting things with them. So I'm expecting to see a huge improvement in our understanding and a shift away from animal test data, very dramatic. I personally predict that by 2025, we'll be doing most of our safety testing, including in drugs, using other systems. The ethical calculus that in this area has now shifted for chimpanzees. Thanks to the IOM committee chaired by Dr. Khan, we've now got a change in that. Francis Collins has just recently announced that the 50 that they were going to keep, well, maybe not anymore. It was always a political rather than a scientific decision. And now that nobody's asking for chimpanzees in research, why should we keep them? So we're going to do away with those 50 chimpanzees, and we'll end up with none of them. But in the UK, primate dog and cat use is 25% of 1990 numbers. And I suspect, I can predict, that we're going to be very interested in primate dog and cat use over the course of the next decade. So wild animals. A number of interesting papers have come up in terms of our interaction with wild animals and nature. Ulrich in '84 showed that if you had a view of nature, you recovered from cholecystectomy quicker than if you didn't. Interesting case study where there were 4 cholecystectomy rooms, 2 looked on a wall, 2 looked at nature, and looking at the use of painkillers and the time to discharge, showed a significant difference between the two that looked at the wall. So that was a sort of singular paper saying nature is important to humans. You've got Professor Koss at UC Davis has done a lot of looking at photos in space stations and Antarctic Station, and they find that if the predator is in the photograph staring out at you, that's stressful. If it's not staring out at you, that's unstressful, that's relaxing. So, I mean, there are these sorts of issues that you have, and very minor cues change the way one sees them. You've got a huge issue about emerging diseases as we destroy more and more of the wild space on this planet. The number of vertebrate animals that we have today is 52% down from 1970, which is perhaps not surprising when you consider that the human footprint has increased by about 450% in that period. So, but as we move deeper into the jungles, we bring more of the diseases out. And so West Nile virus was identified by Koresh at the Bronx Zoo in their research unit. Ebola, of course, has been a huge issue, and a whole host of other viruses as well, Nipah, SARS, etc. And you've got now some organizations, the Wildlife Center of Virginia, it's this tiny little group, $1 million a year income, down in outside Charlottesville in Virginia. They're a wildlife rehab center, and they've been working with the military, who's funded them to develop this surveillance app to sort of track diseases coming into these wildlife centers. And they've got about 20 or so wildlife centers now around the globe that are participating in this. And a recent interesting paper in terms of biophilia, the Wild Crew, an Oxford research group, looked at natural environment effects on human health, and what you find: improved mood, improved concentration, enhanced general well-being, correlation between proximity to nature and overall health. And then this very recent paper that just came across my desk a couple of days ago, a colleague forwarded it to me, nature and crime rates. Exposure to nature accounted for 8% of the variance in community cohesion and 4% of the variability in crime rates. Now this may seem small, but when you look at age, income, and gender together, it accounted for only 3%. So we study age, income, gender in terms of crime rates. We've got massive data, but we've got no data on the influence of nature. There was a PhD thesis that looked at crime rates around two communities, one of which had a slaughter plant and one which didn't, and the slaughter plant community had a much higher level of crime rate than the one that didn't. There are a lot of issues here, a lot of issues and a lot of important public health issues. So, psychosocial issues. One of the papers that I found immensely valuable was a paper by Edmund Leach, the anthropologist, Cambridge anthropologist, who wrote this odd paper, Verbal Categories in Terms of Abuse, in 1964. It was, in fact, a talk he gave at MIT, and it appeared in an MIT proceedings of that conference. And he noted that there were 3 categories of swear words in human society, and it didn't matter what language you were speaking. These are fairly widespread and fairly the same pretty much. Profanities, obscenities, and animal terms. And it's easy, the claim was, and I think he's right, you can see why words dealing with God and words dealing with sex have linguistic power, but animal terms, why would you, son of a bitch, or you swine, have linguistic power? Why would those terms have linguistic power? And what Leach argued was that these animals that we swear by occupy this boundary space between humans and not humans. And he's a structural anthropologist, so for him, boundary spaces are really interesting places. And so he was saying, you know, Mary Douglas wrote The Purity and Danger, and he was saying, you know, you've got body hair and menstrual blood is dangerous stuff because it's of us but not of us. And so he was sort of arguing that these animals that we swear by are in this boundary space. And he looked at edibility here, and pets are inedible, wild animals are inedible, livestock are edible if castrated, edible only if hunted and prepared for ritual. So animals and animal themes in society. Children's literature is rife with animal characters. Nobody's really looked at it very deeply. Media images and advertising, a lot of issues about that. Popular culture, such as sports teams. This Disney, Stephen Jay Gould looked at the domestication, or shall we say the infantilization of Mickey Mouse, from Steamboat Willie to the mouse we know in 1952. And you see the big eyes, the ears shifted back, the short stubby limbs, all neotenic characteristics. And teddy bears are another huge issue. In terms of higher education, I wanted to end with a sort of couple of comments on higher education. These are the university degree programs globally, and it shows that these only two, the Tufts program and the Edinburgh program, were started before 2000, 1995, and about 1993. And so all of these have come on board since then. And this is a look at the scholarly human-animal interaction books published per annum in each decade. And you can see that I used to be able to read every book that came out back here. I don't do that anymore. So conclusions. Animals in society is a focus of rapidly expanding public and academic interest. There are huge public health implications across a very wide range of topics and disciplines, well worth a concentration of a program, especially in animal production. But the impact of nature on humans and humans on nature, biophilia, is a big issue, but for the most part, we're just looking at it from a conservation perspective, not from a human health perspective. Values and ethics, there's a huge ongoing challenge. Sarabji was an author of sort of a classicist who looked at the ancient Greek examination of animals in society and animal mentality and animal moral status, and said that despite Aristotle and Plato and the others' huge influence, they were as messed up about the status of animals and the moral status of animals as we are today. There are no animals in public health academic programs yet established anywhere in the world. We've got this ongoing issue about climate change and the implications there. There are just, to me, this is a program that I think you will find many students coming in. I started the Tufts program because people kept asking me, is there a master's degree anywhere? I have had people ask me, is there a master's degree in this animals and public health array? This is something that I would argue is something, its time has come. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
We'll open it up for a few questions, very limited number. Andrew, I'll take prerogative. One thing you pointed out was that when animals became domesticated, there was a huge increase in infectious disease. Has that been followed up more recently as some of the nomadic people in sub-Saharan Africa and so forth have become less nomadic?
It's not an area that is, frankly, I spend much time on. Those slides were thanks to Michael Greger, who's our animals and public health, farm animals and public health expert. But I know there's a lot of literature in the emergence of diseases at the time of, shall we say, human domestication, when people settle down in communities.
So we have a question here. Let's ask people to identify themselves too.
Lance Price, George Washington University. This is sort of a difficult question, for me anyway. It seems that most pets, most companion pets, most of the popular ones are carnivorous. And so it would seem that by sort of promoting companion animals, you're also propping up this industrial ag that you described as being so horrible. And I agree with that, actually. But so can you talk about that tension and how you deal with it?
Well, dogs aren't obligate carnivores, so you can feed dogs without reverting to carnivory, although some people think that that's a horrible practice. Cats are obligate carnivores. So the cat is less of a pet, frankly, than the dog is. The dog is more attached than cats, except for cat people. Cat people, dogs are not. And they are two different populations. When I was at Tufts and we had to do dog health symposia and cat health symposia on the same day, we always had to put the cat people in a different room for lunch. But to get back, yeah, there is an issue there, but at this point in time, we waste so much animal product that the pet food companies are buying most of that from the food that we won't eat, the stuff we won't eat. And as long as we're eating 110 kilograms of meat and animal products a year, there's going to be sufficient left over for some of the cats.
Back here.
Hi, I'm Stephen Eisman, Northwestern University. You showed in a graph that the number of animals used in commercial laboratories for research has been going down. But I wonder whether the amount of animal use in universities has compensatorily gone up. Have you found that to be the case? And if so, what are the implications of that for animal protection?
The number of animals used, as opposed to simply bred in university labs, has gone up. All of these data, by the way, come from the UK because the US data is useless. So we can't rely on US data for anything very much at all. Canada has reasonably good data we can rely on. And what's interesting in Canada is that the use of animals was declining steadily till 1993. And except for rats, it's been going up steadily since 1993. The rats have continued to go down. I'm not sure why that is, but these are the sorts of trends that I think we should be looking at and sort of figuring out why and what's going on.
Andrew, thank you very, very much.
One more, Alan. I promise one more.
Promised. Thank you. Andrew, a wonderful summary, and I appreciate your optimism. One topic that I wonder if you might touch on that has very strong public health implications is the relationship between animal abuse and human violence. And this is something that a lot of people are publishing on. There's mixed data on it, but it seems pretty well established that there is some correlation. And there's a number of policy implications that stem from that. I wonder if you might want to comment on that.
Quickly, human violence, animal abuse links. Absolutely. Wherever we look, we see these links. It's one of the reasons why we the Humane Society of the United States, has been able to convert many of the animal protection laws across the states. In fact, all 50 states now have felony animal cruelty. In 1984, only 4 did. So that's been a huge change driven by this concern about the links between human and animal violence. And somebody who deliberately tortures an animal is an individual you really want to be aware of, because they tend to do that when they're children, and people tend to turn it off and say just boys will be boys, usually boys. But it's not just boys will be boys, because that person will later graduate to inflicting violence on humans. So it's a huge public health, public security issue. One of the interesting aspects here is that while there's lots of data now showing the links between animal abuse and human violence, there's no data showing that if you're kind to animals, you're going to be kind to humans. And so we're looking at some projects to try and identify some of that. In South Africa, where the level of criminal violence is huge, we're hoping that some sort of humane education programs might see a decline in violence. But there is nothing, we all believe it. Following Thomas Aquinas, we all believe that claim that being kind to animals is good, but there is no data supporting it.
Thank you all. And thank you, Andrew.